This is episode 1142.
But the reason why I wanted to join Webtoon, despite the fact that it was going public, was because JK, Jungu Kim, our founder, had created something I had never seen. Webtoon now is the only global digital storytelling hub I know of, where there's an evergreen source of 120,000 stories every day from 24 million creators. By the way, these 24 million creators, almost all of them have full-time jobs. So the ability to tell a story and to see if the story in their head resonates with 156 million monthly active users, it democratizes access to stories. It empowers someone who's working really hard with a dream that they could become a storyteller. It enables people's lives to change.
When we think about transformation, we often picture factories, data platforms, or supply chains, not storytelling. Yet for CFO David Lee, the transformation has always been the plot line. From PG&E's crisis years to Impossible Foods' rise, he's mastered the art of reinventing business models in moments of disruption. Now at Webtoon, where 24 million creators share stories with over 150 million readers, he's applying that same discipline to creativity itself. This isn't just about scaling a platform. It's about safeguarding human imagination in the age of AI. So how does a finance leader measure the value of a story? We find out after this. Hello, CFO David Lee is with us. David is the global COO and CFO of Webtoon, the world's largest webcomic platform, engaging more than 150 million readers each month. His career journey crosses industries, from leading finance at Zigna as the company transitioned to mobile, to guiding Impossible Foods through hypergrowth and global commercialization. Hey, David, welcome.
Great. It's great to be here with you.
David, you have a real interesting background, so we've been looking forward to asking you to look back for us and try to identify those experiences you believe helped shape you and put you on the CFO path ultimately. What would those be for you?
Well, I think one of the most formidable, let's do that again. I think one of the most formative experiences for me happened in college, actually. Even before I began my career, I had entered college under the presupposition that I would become a medical doctor, as my parents desperately wished me to be. And I found myself rather late in my college career wondering, what am I going to do for a living? And I remember looking at this problem naively, with so many of my colleagues well prepared for law school or business school, with internships already baked into their experience. And I was forced to look at business outside in, almost on a first principle basis. And I recall thinking, gosh, when I had started a few ventures in college, the most important thing, the most important skill was to be able to predict what people would pay for, what consumers are willing to pay for. And as a result, I very innocently and naively said, you know what, I'm going to start my career at an ad agency called the Leo Burnett Company in Chicago. Probably an unusual start for a public company CFO. But the reason why that was so important is I had almost the need to imagine my career without any experience of having had one, to trust my instincts and to think about things independently. And at Burnett, we were stuck managing groups of people far too early in our career. They sometimes made the advertising job akin to an air traffic controller. We had deadlines and budgets and schedules and shoots to make and clients to please. And it taught me very early on how to walk in the shoes of the consumer. And how do you get a group of people to agree with making an investment decision? I remember launching a car for General Motors and realizing half the budget was not in the hands of my client at GM. It was in the hands of dealers, successful millionaires, often whom had never had a career outside of selling cars, who didn't share the same educational background as me and my team. So figuring out how to gain credibility with teams, really thinking closely about who owns the decision rights to making investments, and then imagining what the consumer was going to pay for something brand new, I think was a pretty formative early experience that taught me how to be a better CFO, how to advise CMOs when launching new to the world products or things the world hadn't seen before.
You do go back for an MBA. What were you thinking when you made that decision?
Well, it's interesting. I remember being asked by my client, would brand management as an organizational structure work for the car industry? And somehow this came to me. And I had thought that I knew a lot about marketing at the time. I had launched a couple of major new brands and had gotten my feet wet managing budgets and teams. But I felt totally ill-prepared to answer this question about organizational design. I really didn't even know how to approach the problem. One of the other clients at Leo Burnett was Procter & Gamble, who had pioneered this notion of brand management. And as I talked to my colleagues who were serving that client, it reinforced the idea that I knew very little outside of strategic marketing. I was in Chicago, dating someone at the time in Chicago, wanting to stay in the city. And Chicago has great institutions, but it includes Kellogg, which was rather known to the ad industry as having a great marketing acumen, and the University of Chicago, which was really, at the time anyway, it wasn't even called Booth School of Management as it is now. It was really meant for hardcore finance folks. And I think, as a second example of being so impressed by this early decision that I had to make, on a first principle basis, I said, well, if I don't know anything about finance or corporate strategy, and I know a little bit about marketing, I better find my way to the University of Chicago to learn about everything I didn't know. Coincidentally, at the time I was to begin my MBA program, I was approached because there was this war for talent happening where everyone was running to new internet startups. And a strategic consulting firm in Chicago called McKinsey began to experiment with hiring folks into their post-MBA level, what they called an associate. Analysts were usually out of undergrad, associates were usually out of JDs, PhDs, and MBAs. And I was one of the first handful of experimental hires of someone who had no graduate degree at the time, as I was about to begin my graduate degree, into a postgraduate degree level, an associate. So I ended up doing the McKinsey experience. McKinsey treated me like they would treat a freshly minted PhD in English literature. They sent me off to mini MBAs at INSEAD in Europe. They tried to boot camp me into training me up. And it was such an educational experience for me to be able to be treated like I was in a crash course trying to learn a new foreign language is what it felt like in a matter of 8 weeks before I began my consulting career. While at the same time, I ended up completing my MBA at the University of Chicago. It was this very concentrated period of 2 to 3 years where I was heavily leaning into learning about everything I didn't know. I really was lucky to be able to do both of those things at the same time.
And, I just find it interesting that within, again, you're at McKinsey nearly 2 years, but shortly thereafter, you're at PG&E Corp as a director of strategic planning. So it seems like you found your your finance lane, more or less. You're becoming more of traditional finance, or how would you characterize that role that you stepped into there?
It's funny. I think sometimes when I think about my own career, I'd love to tell you it was very logical. One step led exactly to the next. When the reality is, I think for a lot of us, our personal lives have more than a small impact on our choices of career. In Chicago, I met the woman who I was to eventually marry, and she got a great job in California. And she had moved to Chicago in the course of our relationship, and it was my turn to follow her or lose her. And so candidly, the move to California, the move to the Bay Area was less about me wanting to work for a regulated utility company, which is what PG&E Corporation is. It's the local San Francisco based, big energy utility play. It was more me, following the woman that I wanted to marry and seeking to be employed, and this was at a time when the internet bubble had burst. So, the go-go days of free-flowing capital to digital magazines and the early notions of the web had dried up in San Francisco. So I was really grateful to find, frankly, any way to make a living that paid off some of my former experience. And so leveraging some of that experience for, at the time, PG&E was in a big transformation. I mean, if the time they had something called the first California energy crisis. This is when Governor Gray Davis was in a pitched battle in California against the local regulator. PG&E went through, at the time, the largest bankruptcy restructuring in American business history. And there I was at the center of it, being asked by a new CFO, a gentleman named Peter Darby, who said, these utility veterans kind of got us into this. You know nothing about the energy industry, but you have some background in thinking on your feet. And he put me in this great role where he said, hey, my FP&A team is giving me this forecast. Treasury's telling me to do a debtor in possession loan. You are forced to come up with an alternative from the outside in. And so I just would run around the company being the anti-CFO. If Treasury wanted to do a DIP loan, I made up a preferred equity line from KKR. If the forecast said we were going to get out of trouble, and next time I would come up with a fact base to suggest otherwise. I was the rebuttal to the mainstream financing. It gave me this amazing ability, again, for another lucky moment in my career, to have access to decisions and information that I had no right having, given my lack of experience. But it gave me a crash course on how do you react to a Fortune, 500 company, public company in deep trouble. How do you get that company out of trouble? And how do you think independently when everyone's telling you that their experience is the right direction to take? How do you come up with a different path? Was essentially my first experience in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I think it was a great example of me being lucky, but also being rewarded for thinking independently.
I want to point out along the way just a really interesting number of different companies that you were part of, but you also invested your time with certain companies. Del Monte, nearly 9 years at Del Monte, and that's really, I believe, where you advanced into the upper ranks of the finance organization. You can correct me or characterize it. You're also sort of always involved in operations. You're not maybe as traditional finance as some. But also, I just want to also point out at Impossible Foods, you invested 5 years as a C-suite executive, chief operating officer, and CFO. So in this sort of abbreviated way that we have of looking at your journey, I just want to get across to the listeners that you are making this investment with certain companies. Can we talk about Del Monte a little bit? Reflect
Sure.
on that. Was that a wise investment? Again, 9 years. It's that's a considerable amount of time.
Yeah, for me, I look back, maybe in retrospect, but I look back and think of my investments in time really being in investments in companies that are going through a transformation. In the case of Del Monte, they have tripled in size through acquisition. They're a public company, centuries old. Its origin in canned fruit and veg that had bought and built its way into higher growth, more interesting businesses like pet snacks. And through this reverse Morris Trust acquisition with Heinz, they found themselves tripling in size. And the change program was being initiated by the CEO, and McKinsey was serving him. So this connection to McKinsey in my past helped me because McKinsey was telling the CEO, listen, you got to have people on the team who's going to lead this transformation, integrate the two other businesses you've acquired, but also change the way that we operate in categories you've never been in. And so my 9-year journey felt initially like it was going to be a 3-year super intense transformation program. But I found myself at the time thinking that I didn't want to just be a short-term executive. I wanted to learn a craft. And the easiest, most open pathway to me at the time was actually to run up through finance. So starting as a director in financial planning and analysis, learning to do IR, learning to understand the language of accounting, becoming a divisional CFO progressively took time, and inclusive of those 9 years, I was desperate after being a divisional CFO and a head of FP&A. I was desperate to prove that I could still run marketing, that I knew how to run plants. And so at the end of that 9-year period, before it was taken private, a transaction I led to KKR Centerview Investar, I ran the consumer products business. So this was about half of the $2 or $3 billion top line of the company. And for me, I remember those 9 years as being almost a self-determined apprenticeship to get the skills to be a CFO. But frankly, once I had enough of the finance experience, I was pretty dead set on proving that I was more than a CFO. I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder, right? Getting that first P&L, managing bigger teams, running sales, product marketing, ops, was more driven by insecurity and ego than probably the merit of my ability. And so for me, when I look back at those 9 years, there are a lot of lessons on the skills I've gained, but there's also a lot of great lessons for me about how I might be able to mentor others. Because, once you've done something you're desperate to prove, you realize it's not all cracked up to be. And so understanding, what do you really enjoy doing, which is not just to prove everybody you can do more, but what do you really enjoy doing day to day, was a big part of the lessons that I learned over those 9 years, and it carried through to the next set of transformations. The theme of my background seems random, right? Mobile gaming, a regulated utility, consumer packaged goods, turning around an omnichannel retailer, plant-based food, and now Webtoon. But the commonality is they were all companies in massive transformation that were willing to try some new business model because technology enabled them to consider something different. And that is something I enjoy, I think, fundamentally thinking about and working on.
When a sort of transformation becomes your brand, are your future opportunities that you land at, and again, you are a senior finance executive at a number of them, different companies that follow Del Monte, is it the board members who you're connecting with? How are you being found? Is it executive recruiters? Is it your network? How is it done?
I like to say to those that I have a chance to chat with who are earlier in their career, that mentors don't pick mentees. That mentees, individuals, folks who are up and coming, they stalk, convince, wheedle, cajole, attract the mentors who end up willing to spend time with them. And when I think about the sequence of my career, there was always a mentor or an organization acting as a mentor to me. We talked about how early days at McKinsey allowed me to, after PG&E's transformation, find an introduction to Del Monte. It wasn't LinkedIn of yore or my Harvard connections or University of Chicago connections. It was someone who had known me at McKinsey saying, hey, this client desperately needs someone to lead a transformation. The audit committee chair at Del Monte, a wonderful executive, her name is Sharon McCullum. She was the COO and CFO of Williams-Sonoma, had done a massive transformation of Williams-Sonoma, someone who I very much admired. She took a special interest in me when I was at Del Monte, when I was presenting to the board. She would end up coming out of retirement with Hubert Joly, a new CEO at Best Buy, to turn around Best Buy right after Circuit City went bankrupt. And everyone said, there's no way you can turn around a retailer. A Fortune 100 retailer in trouble, big trouble. The hostile takeover battle is reported by the founder, Dick Schultz. But we did it, and I had a chance to do it because Sharon, reached out to me and said, "Hey, I'm looking at this independently. You seem to look at problems with an independent mind. What do you see when you see this company?" And off we went. And it was probably in contrast to the 9 years at Del Monte, it was the fastest transformation I've ever been. I mean, within 15 months, that company had been turned around. It became, I think, the second or third fastest growing stock in the S&P during the time that we were there. But again, a connection, a mentor who took interest in me, but I probably ensured that she has spent time with me when we overlapped at Del Monte. And I can go on and on. The CFO role at Zynga, someone called Sharon McCullum and said, "Hey, we want you. You're the CFO we want." And she said, "I'm busy, but you should talk to one of the people I'm developing named David Lee." And off I went to my first public company tech CFO job. So for me, mentorship is something you have to work really hard at cultivating as a mentee. And it's a reason why I really do enjoy in being an operator, trying to find ways to help folks who are looking for mentors themselves.
We have a few more questions, though, that we can ask you later in the podcast. Right now, let's find out about this opportunity, Webtoon. And I'll mention, again, you were at Impossible 5 years as CFO and COO, and you will join Webtoon in late 2023. So you've been there now 2 years, roughly. But tell us what the opportunity was and what's exciting about this company? What sets it apart?
Well, Webtoon for me was so compelling. I was willing to come out of what I call public company retirement. I was really happy living in startup land, launching the Impossible Burger from the very beginning, becoming the butt of every late night talk show intentionally as part of our launch plan. All of that was so fun. But the reason why I wanted to join Webtoon, despite the fact that it was going public, was because JK, Jungkook Kim, our founder, had created something I had never seen. Webtoon now is the only global digital storytelling hub I know of, where there's an evergreen source of 120,000 stories every day from 24 million creators. By the way, these 24 million creators, almost all of them have full-time jobs. So the ability to tell a story and to see if the story in their head resonates with 156 million monthly active users. It democratizes access to stories. It empowers someone who's working really hard with a dream that they could become a storyteller. It enables people's lives to change. And it's also a hit with the generation of users that I think are most attractive, Gen Z, here in the US, for example. In fact, we grew like 19% last quarter, year on year. We call our target consumer Maddie because I wanted to put a name and a face to our target. Maddie call her 23, 24 years old. She thinks we're more interesting than Netflix, TikTok, and Roblox because she finds that we're the only place where she can find stories that she can't find anywhere else because we're the global leader of this format called a webcomic. And for her, she didn't grow up with paper-based comics or cartoons. She is looking for a great app, a great experience with a flick of her finger on her phone to see an unexpected story from some storyteller in the world. And I love all of that. I love the use of technology and AI as a force for good to protect human creativity and creators. I love democratizing access to storytelling. And I really like the fact that this format that our founder created, it's a hit on our platform, but it's such a pure form of a story. We have 100 examples where something is a webcomic on your Webtoon app turns into a hit TV, a movie, a rich film adaptation, an animation series. So for me, I was really compelled by the mission. And after launching the Impossible Burger, I told myself and my family that if I could only work on things that made the world a better place, but also gave investors a tremendous return, then I would solely focus on those things. And that's what I think Webtoon can do for the world. So, we're young as a public company. We're 20 years old, but we're only less than 2 years old, listed on NASDAQ last year. And we have a long way to go, but I'm extremely excited about where this company could go.
There was a recent announcement, I believe. I remember hearing something about this, but Webtoon recently announced a collaboration with Disney, and it involves integrating Marvel, Star Wars, Pixar, while also Webtoon welcomes Disney as a strategic investor. I think it's something like 2% equity stake. How do you view this partnership? It must be this milestone partnership, I would imagine, in terms of Webtoon's global strategy. What does this mean?
Well, I'm so grateful for the ability to partner with a global powerhouse like Disney. I think it speaks volumes to the fact that Webtoon is already mainstream. You know, when I talk to my investor friends or even my colleagues who are in their 50s plus like me, they may never have heard of Webtoon, but I bet they saw our story on Amazon Prime or Netflix, or may not have realized it started as a story from an amateur creator in our platform. They probably experienced the impact of our stories. But more importantly, when they talk to their friends and family who are in this age group, particularly in the US of 18 to 25 Gen Z, as I did my daughters, you know, I'd never heard of the company, but my daughters are like, duh, Dad, yeah, like my entire class enjoys reading Wattpad and Webtoon stories. When I know that we're already mainstream with Gen Z consumers here in the US and increasingly becoming so, I think Disney will speed the process up for people to give that credit and recognize it. One of the things that I'm excited about is the rich library of stories. I mean, Pixar, Star Wars, we have Spider-Man now on our platform, 20th Century. You know, we already had partnered with DC Comic. We had already done work with IDW, Godzilla, Sonic the Hedgehog. But we can now use the power of our creators. You know, what you may not have noticed is that we also announced in working with Disney that with their agreement, we will use our creators to come up with original news stories, which is the strength of our platform, right? We have these 24 million creators. We don't just buy stories. Our ecosystem produces them organically. I imagine alternative endings to franchises like the Avengers or Tony Stark, or you name the Disney platform, that bring life to the story and maybe bring access to generations of consumers that may not have grown up with some of these storied franchises that they offer. So what I hope is that it makes the inevitable faster in the US, which is that people begin to recognize that we have a wonderful platform. It also combines two different things. Like we have audience, we have 156 million monthly active users, but we've got 24 million creators. So being able not just to provide access to our users, great stories from Disney, but also to leverage our creators to create new original stories, I think is unique. So we're really excited about the Disney collaboration.
What can you tell us about the performance metrics that matter to you day to day, week to week? What are the numbers, top of mind metrics that you look at daily to understand where the business is, how it's performing? What are you looking at?
I look at growth, and I'll give you a couple of metrics, the quality of the user and creator experience, and financial health. And I look at them in those rank orders. So let's talk about growth. I mentioned already, knowing that our English platform amongst our app users on webcomics grew 19%. That's important because while we're 50% market penetration where we started in Korea, we're only just getting going here in what we call the rest of the world. So that pure growth, number of new users on our app reading webcomics in a new market, like the English markets, is important. But then the quality of the engagement is very important. You know, how much time are they spending? You know, we know that on average, our users spend 30 to 60 minutes every day, actually. Are we providing them great stories? You know, one stat I look at is something like 97% of our North America consumers in a third-party study, they said that our experience was more fun than TikTok's, Roblox, Netflix. Great alternatives, by the way. So good company. And the reason is 77% said it's because they can't find these stories anywhere else. we look at that very closely because our lifeblood is the fact that we could provide access to stories that none of us could have imagined or purchased in advance. We're not a store model, right? We have these great creators that provide new stories to the platform. But on the other hand, deals like Disney mean that if we can grow at a financial profit, if we can deliver adjusted EBITDA that's positive, but still grow our revenue. And I look at things on a constant currency basis for revenue because we're global. And, when martial law is declared in Korea last year, or the yen is at a 30-year low at some point last year versus the USD, these don't really reflect financial health, right? The constant currency growth is what's important because our bottom line is somewhat insulated since we oftentimes pay costs in the same currency that we receive revenue. So, growth, quality of engagement between customers and creators, and financial health are the three areas that I look at every day. The great thing about this place, Webtoon, is that it's fundamentally data-driven. I don't have to guess. We measure everything. And I think that's important in this day and age where, everyone's talking. I was just at a conference in San Francisco where agentic AI, everyone's saying that agentic AI is going to destroy every industry. I don't see it that way. Like, we're using AI and technology and data to promote human creativity, to help our creators. And part of it is our business model's different. Since we share future revenue with our creators, we can root for them to be successful, and they can leverage every advantage they can in our platform to help them be more productive. To fight piracy is another great example, or to we use AI to let consumers have the fastest access to the stories they're going to like. So for me, these metrics are super important, and the use of AI and data just enables them to be more successful.
We have a few AI related questions for you, David, but I want to just circle back with metrics. And we're curious, since your arrival there 2 years ago, if there was a particular measurement or metric that you determined wasn't getting the attention it required from the organization or from a functional group. Did you help raise the profile of a particular metric? And again, this is something we enjoy asking finance leaders. Did they arrive into a new role and quickly identify, something from their past experience that perhaps needed to be understood better throughout the organization? Could be practically anything. But any metric or KPI come to mind?
Yeah, a couple. But first I want to be clear. It's not that I'm, the unique genius that came up with these metrics. I think these metrics were identified by the team, but I think underlying the importance, because we have many metrics, two come to mind. One is what I just described, which is looking at webcomic app MAU, monthly active user growth, by language is super important because, if you look at total MAU, our total monthly active users, that includes businesses that we don't choose to monetize for revenue. We have a huge web novel business, a business called Wattpad in multiple languages. It's a wonderful business to allow UGC creators to create content that we really value, that oftentimes turn into movies, etc. But the paid revenue part of that business is not the priority. So, for example, double-clicking, as I say, on the right metric that predicts really future revenue growth is really this kind of web comic app MAU, which is, as I mentioned, nicely growing here in the U.S. and other English platform countries. I think the other one that I would highlight is about the platform I just mentioned, Wattpad. We measure everything, but reading time is super important because, when you allow anyone for free to look at all this content, what I really am interested in is when they choose to engage, how deeply do they choose to engage? And unlike other platforms, I don't need to worry about them using up my content, right? I have new stories arriving every day to the platform, but making sure they find content to engage on, I think, is another important metric. And then, of course, we all look at the financial metrics, right? Obsessively. I don't think there's a lot of insight there, but those are two examples kind of in the area of what I mentioned, growth and the quality of engagement that I think we are increasingly highlighting externally for our investors.
The quality of that investment, let me segue to AI here. Is AI helping the company better understand the audience behavior and engagement? Is that a role AI is likely to play already?
I think AI is being used to help us protect the creator, specifically to fight piracy. To give them more time back so that they can use less time on that next episode that they're crafting. And I think it's also being used to help the consumer, in our case, have these personalized AI recommendation engines so that, because we have so much content, we talk about 120,000 stories we're writing every day, but making sure when you're on our platform, you can see content that you want to read, I think is important. And I think those are examples that are pretty much already underway that we've talked about as a public company. I think the bright line, though, for us in AI is that we believe human storytellers are the best storytellers. And by the way, we know the state of what everybody else is doing in what's called Gen AI, but human storytellers are the best creative sources of news stories. And we think it's our obligation to protect our creators. So we will never use our AI or tech to threaten or replace our human creators. One, because it's not the right thing to do, but more importantly, they are coming up with the best stories. And so that's our stance on use of technology. But we started as a tech company. We were born out of a company called Naver. Naver is this incredibly strong tech company that started in Korea, publicly listed in Korea. So this is where our heritage began as a company.
Let's ask you about finance and AI. Is your finance team currently using AI, or how is it using?
Well, as a young public company, making sure that we address what was defined as part of the IPO process, the SOX remediation process, we are already using AI to be able to compare documentation to essentially do reconciliation from a SOX standpoint. I was really impressed by the team that I inherited. Because when they came to me and said, hey, by the way, we're using this off-the-shelf product, we wrote a little program in this language, and it's really helping. To me, that's an example where it's less about AI itself winning versus humanity. It's more like how many humans can use AI effectively. There are a lot of tools that are available to all of us to be more effective in what we do, and I think our finance team's a pretty good example of that.
What's the type of mindset as a finance leader that you would like to be known for when it comes to AI? There's such a curiosity around it. Again, at the same time, you have a lot of, there are risks associated with it as well. What is your leadership mindset when it comes to AI?
I think before you talk about use of any technology, and we have many examples of this, right? In our past, AI just happens to be what we're talking about a lot these days. You have to start with the principles of the organization. As I mentioned, the bright lines that you don't cross, and your fundamental growth strategy isn't AI. AI is just a tool. Like, for example, we will grow by allowing more and more creators to create better and better content for more and more consumers, human creators. When I think about the use of any technology, whether it's AI or back when I was doing mobile gaming, large data sets and machine learning was the talk of the press. I think instead of calling it this ubiquitous thing, you have to have a strategy and guardrails for your business and your stakeholders, and you have to ruthlessly abide by them. You have to make sure that the rules don't change for the technology. You can change behavior, you can adapt, so you can become more productive. But some bright lines cannot change, independent of the current state of the tech. Now, that doesn't mean one stays rigid to business models that will be replaced. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you need to apply the technology within a strategy and what feels right amongst your stakeholders first. And I think I'd like to be known for that, for starting with strategy and the right set of guidelines, the bright lines first, and then ruthlessly applying every advantage within that framework is the way I'd love to be known.
Well, we are up to our, what we like to refer to as our finance strategic moment, David. This is where we ask our guests to look back in time and just share a moment of insight that they've experienced along the way, a unique moment of insight that's kind of due to the lines of sight that finance executives enjoy. Tell us, do you have one for us?
I mean, the one that comes to mind, we haven't yet talked about it a lot. And it's near and dear to my heart because I love when great leadership proves others wrong. This is a story about Best Buy, and this is not my insight. I completely give credit to Hubert Joly, the incoming CEO of Best Buy, and Sharon McCollum, a mentor, who joined as their CFO and head of IT, where the current thinking was, well, Circuit City's going bankrupt, and nobody wants to go brick and mortar, and Amazon is going to destroy anyone who tries to sell consumer products. But if you looked at consumer behavior, take the example of your mobile phone. The level of involvement and dedication that you have to your mobile phone, my God, if people lose their mobile phone, it's like they panic, right? So instead of leaning into the fears that Amazon's going to destroy Best Buy or people don't want to actually go into a store, coming up with the human insight that people want to shop, they want to go into a store, they want to put it in their hand, they want to try it on, they want to see the different services, see what covers you have, but they also want to be able to, in that store, order it on their phone online. Or they want to be able to have it shipped to their front door. Seeing a company like Best Buy cut $1 billion plus out of costs, so I'm not saying it was easy, but funnel those cost savings into being what I call the omnichannel showroom, allowing people to go into a Best Buy, try something, order it at home, pick it up in a Best Buy. You know, at the time, Best Buy, the average Best Buy was within 15 minutes of the average consumer electronics buyer. You could outfulfill Amazon back then and give them a place to actually try the product to create more engagement, have them get it faster, and, you know, with the cost savings, make it price competitive. To me, that's an example of a business that people had written off at the time of the start of the transformation, where it leveraged an understanding of the consumer engagement plus hard knocks finance and turned that ship around. We called it Renew Blue. And as I mentioned, it may have been the fastest public company turnaround I've been a part of. All credit to Hubert and Sharon for the insight to look at the problem differently. It's probably one of my favorite stories to tell, even if I was just one of many on the team. I think it's a powerful one.
That's a great share for us. Thank you for that, David. We're up to what we like to refer to as our mentoring round. I'm going to ask you to look back again. We're wondering about your first CFO tour of duty, the first time you stepped into a CFO role. You had observed CFOs up front and you knew every aspect of the role, or so you thought. If you could go back in time, what is it that you would tell yourself, though, that first 60 or 90 days you just wish someone had mentioned this to you? Anything about the role surprise you?
I think across every role, the common lesson learned for me is I wish someone had told me, don't be in such a rush to prove that you are the right choice. You know, when you're new to an industry, as I typically am, and, you know, I tend to have entered companies where there's a lot more experience in the sector, the industry, and the function. I don't know how many times I was the inexperienced first-timer in fill-in-the-blank role. It can lead you to wanting to really, as quickly as possible, demonstrate that you should have that seat, that you deserve that title. And I think my lesson learned is that taking the time to listen to the team you are entering, to really understand not just the business, that can be rather quick, but how you're going to affect the levers. Who's going to react negatively and why? That takes time. And so I think the lesson learned is sometimes you can have a much faster impact if you're not in a rush to prove yourself. Be in a rush to know what the right thing to do is, even if it's not to your credit, is probably the advice that I could benefit from the most. By the way, I think this is advice I still could benefit from, because human nature doesn't change, you know, and I always rush headlong into industries, teams, business models I have not experienced before. So I think that's probably the advice I wish I could take.
Curious about if you could look back in time for us towards your McKinsey chapter and the war for talent, was that thought leadership on the money? You think back to that time, and again, it was around the .com era, wasn't it? And it was kind of unique economy circumstances, sort of like now.
Yeah, it does, by the way, feel like very similar to now.
Was it a milestone at the time for McKinsey, or do you look at it differently? At the time, I believe it was cast as something transformational, something important. Yeah.
I think my thought is that whenever you have something that's exogenous or that feels like it's entering a system as a surprise, maybe it's not exogenous, maybe it's actually born out of the system itself, there is always a rush to make sure you're not late. At the time that I was joining McKinsey, it was, well, why get an MBA or finish college? Like, you better go to one of these digital magazines. We can name them all. And they were drawing the best and brightest, where people weren't thinking about the economics of how the business would work. There was plenty of money being raised. There was a rush by investors, a rush by employees, a rush by employers to just fuel the fury. And when that happens, human nature always makes mistakes. It's funny. I remember being in that era, hearing so many case studies like, oh gosh, David, let me tell you about company X. Here's why they're the model. And you look back at those case studies 10 or 15 years later, and you realize almost all of them are now case studies in the opposite direction, right? and that's not to indict any strategy consulting firm or expert or author in any era. It's just the nature of something novel and new, and the human behavior to rush as fast as possible. I don't think human wisdom and intelligence speeds up when there's a new technology development. I think new technology developments just create another rush. So on the one hand, I think it's real. There's a great book that I'd recommend actually to anyone, particularly finance people, called Factfulness by Hans Rosling, and it's been carried on by his daughter. It's a great book because, as finance people, we're taught to be cynical, critical thinkers. Like, this boom will bust. This is just like the internet era. AI is a bust. When in the reality is, technology has enabled human progression, as this book very articulate, that it articulates it much better than I could. But at the same time, while you got to recognize technology booms are real, human behavior remains the same, which is we will rush too fast into things that are unknown. And there'll be winners and losers, I think, inevitably. I think it's not very helpful. I can't tell you who the winners and losers are going to be in the next boom, but it's something I've experienced and that I take to heart.
Well, thank you for that. We always like to ask our guests to reflect a little on the personal side for us. We're wondering if there's something perhaps your colleagues might not know about you.
It's hard to come up with something that nobody else knows. I think one thing that most of my colleagues know is that professionally, I have a hard time turning off my brain. I'm one of those people that doesn't sleep enough and probably doesn't like to. And the three things that I've learned that are proven for me to really stop me from thinking about the business problem du jour, which I'm grateful for, is one is golf. I'm a terrible golfer, but I'm in love with the game. Another is cooking. When you're in the live act of cooking something, you're in the moment. And the other is playing poker. So I guess maybe that's not known by my colleagues. But these three things are passions, not just because I love each of them, but because they help me turn off what I'm thinking about for work.
What about a favorite spice or
a favorite spice? Well, I will tell you, I'm increasingly learning to be more Korean. I'm Korean American. I'm a second generation immigrant kid. Korean parents who doesn't speak Korean working for a Korean company. So a lot of the spices I grew up avoiding from Korea, I'm leaning into. So things like gochujang or any of the fermented pastes are the things I like to cook with these days. So I
Interesting.
guess that would be my spice of the moment.
Impart nostalgia for your young family roots. So we are up to our final question. We always ask, we look for your priorities as a CFO for the coming 12 months. What would those be?
I think my priorities for the next 12 months professionally would be to set up Webtoon for the next leg of growth in the rest of the world, in places that don't know us as well, which would be the US, North America, Canada. And to do that, I think I would be equally focused on the growth of our creator and consumer base as I would be on the financial health to fund that investment and growth. I think personally, my priority for the next 12 months is to find more balance. When asked the question, how do you find balance? The short answer is I don't. And so I think if I could focus on those priorities, I'll feel like I've made some modicum of success. That would be what I'd focus on.
David Lee, thank you for joining us on CFO Thought Leader.
Thanks.